For this episode of On the Rocks, I'm excited to welcome Ryan Sistad to talk about his work with Better in Our Backyard and their mission to strengthen the U.S. Upper Midwest economy by advocating for responsible industrial development, including with multiple mining projects. Ryan was born in Fosston, Minnesota, and has been running Better in Our Backyard for almost 4 years out of Duluth. During that time, Better in Our Backyard has grown from 2 members to over 50, while also growing their social media presence to over 15,000 followers, gaining national recognition, and expanding outreach from northern Minnesota to the northern Wisconsin and Michigan regions. Now let's dive in. Well, I'm excited to have you on today. Thanks for coming on the rocks.
No
We've
problem.
been tell me a little bit about what you've been working on lately and kind of what's been going on.
Well, lately, the main thing that we've been working on is there's been some big news in this past year, but as of recently, in terms of projects in northeastern Minnesota and developments, the news hasn't been too earth-shattering lately, both good and bad. So lately, what our mission has been, or not necessarily our mission, but our objectives have been putting on good events here in the region in northeastern Minnesota, and then also too growing our social media following on our LinkedIn and Facebook platforms, and also kind of experimenting with some other platforms that we haven't utilized in the past.
Yeah, and are you finding that social media and the way that you're interacting folks is really starting to pull in maybe young professionals or folks who haven't been following this topic?
Yeah, I really do. Not just young professionals, but also, they're just yesterday I got a call from someone, even though we're, focused on projects in northern Minnesota, I got a call from a gentleman in Utah, I believe, talking about how he didn't know too much about the mining topic, but he hears about the mining industry in Utah, and he's been really liking the
Hmm.
stuff that we've been pushing out. And every once in a while, well, just how we're talking right now, that's how we got each other's attention was, via
Yeah.
LinkedIn and being active on social media. So, yeah, absolutely. I would say, on LinkedIn, on our Facebook following, it's very much very northern Minnesotans following us and folks from the Twin Cities area. But LinkedIn, out of our 6,000 some followers, I would say half of them are from out of state, outside of Minnesota.
I think what you all do really well and what kind of made me connect in with you on social media was this, there's sometimes is a big disconnect between local issues and what people are concerned about locally and like the big picture topic of why should you support mining in your own backyard in general, right? Whether that's in northern Minnesota or anywhere else. And I think y'all do y'all make it sound like I'm Southern. I'm married to a man from Atlanta. That's where that came from. But like, I think it really connects in with folks when you can talk about hyper local issues, but then how they connect with the bigger topics that everyone's talking about right now.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and I appreciate that, by the way. And I noticed that too as well. Midway through last year, I started seeing where we could really, one day we might have messaging that's focused on northeastern Minnesota, but then have also messaging that's focused from a national perspective. And earlier this year, we even changed our logo so that we could pivot, so that if we did want to,
Mm.
highlight a project outside of Minnesota, it'd be appropriate. And so, yeah, absolutely. I mean, just this morning, actually, we just featured a St. Louis County commissioner, which is a county in northeastern Minnesota, talking about how the governor of Minnesota needs to start, voicing his support, basically, essentially, for some of these projects, because Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota, he's a huge advocate for renewable energy. However,
Mm.
we don't ever really see him talk too much about some of the critical projects here in northern Minnesota, like PolyMet's NorthMet project or Twin Metals Minnesota out of Ely. Both are projects
Mhm.
that would be mining a lot of copper and nickel, and the renewable energy industry certainly needs a lot of both of those minerals tremendously. So, and then the next day we might feature a congressman from outside of state, or highlight a graphic, or have a graphic that highlights a certain mineral. So it just kind of, I like to switch it up as much as possible, and try to avoid that complacency with our messaging. And then also too connecting the dots about, how can Twin Metals and Polymet help out from a national defense project, and how can a project like Perpetua out of Idaho play into
Mhm.
that, and where when folks are talking about minerals in the supply chain, where are the projects that can fulfill that need?
Yeah, where can you move the needle, right?
Yep.
And what are the concerns that people bring up locally about, and not to ask you about like specific projects, put folks on the spot, but what are the concerns that people have about mining being in their backyard? What do you hear expressed?
Well, most of the concerns are from the urban areas. So,
Mm,
historically in northeastern Minnesota, there's a city called Duluth that's basically was built off the iron mining industry. The Iron Range has been mining iron ore for over 130 years, but they found massive deposits of copper and nickel, and they've known about that, I believe, since the 60s, roughly. But obviously, over the past couple of decades, mining copper and nickel has become more lucrative in terms
hmm
of profitability for mining companies. So the interest seems to go getting higher and higher in northeastern Minnesota. And to answer your question, in the rural areas on the Iron Range, because of their history and their success with the iron mining industry, there isn't too much concern. Obviously, they all are concerned about the environment, local environment being polluted. And then in Duluth, in the Duluth area, in the Twin Cities area, I don't want to say there's a disconnect, but there kind of is. They're very concerned. It's many folks that didn't grow up in the mining industry that, with Polymet, they're worried that it's going to pollute Lake Superior because there's a watershed that's connected called the Lake Superior watershed that Polymet will be mining nearby. And then also to with Twin Metals Minnesota, the concern is that they would pollute the boundary waters. And then where we try to communicate on Twins End is that the surface area that's going to be affected is very minimal because it's going to be an underground mine. And with Polymet's project, they're actually reusing an existing old iron mine site. So technically, it's a brownfield redevelopment site. And it's technically also Minnesota's first fully permitted copper nickel mining project in Minnesota.
So I'm putting myself in your shoes a little bit, or a Minnesotan's shoes. I grew up in Maine, right? I mean, a very rural state where, stewardship of the environment and tourism go sort of hand in hand. And I know there's a project that's gotten some press in Maine as well, that there's a lot of resistance to, because people see this idea of mining in a rural area and tourism or environmental stewardship as 100% in conflict. And I wonder if that's a similar scenario what you see in Minnesota. Like if we bring mines back up into production, then nobody's going to want to come canoe, fish, hunt in our state. Is that part of what goes on?
Yeah, I think so, and they're it's a very good comparison. I think across the country you see that kind of the rural versus urban feel, and
Hmm
I think one thing that Duluthians and folks in the cities need to be reminded of is in northeastern Minnesota, that's how industry is what creates great paying jobs in
hmm
the area, and that's kind of it's almost kind of become the tourism industry versus the mining industry, and I believe that both of them can coexist. You can have a thriving mining industry in the area and still have a thriving tourism area. So, like for example, Twin Metals is located technically out of Ely, Minnesota. That's a huge tourist town. Many folks from across the country visit the Boundary Waters. They enjoy the
hmm
area, but so do the miners of northern Minnesota too. They recreate there as well.
Yeah.
So, just communicating that message that hey, they care about the environment just as much as we do, or as everyone else does. It's just that they recognize the need for these minerals, and they also recognize what these jobs mean for the region. Because it's kind of, I think that a national average for a mining wage is roughly $75,000 a year. And
hmm
in Minnesota, the average mining wage is approaching 100 grand a year. And when you
Wow.
look at some of these rural communities where, average prices of homes are quite a bit lower than Duluth and the cities, the cost of living on average is less than from living in urban areas. That type of wage goes really far. I mean, that's how you build a future for yourself. And when you see folks on the Iron Range, when they hear of opposition against these projects, I don't know if they're necessarily thinking that they're trying to protect the environment. I think their first thoughts
Mm.
are is this is kind of threatening my livelihood a little bit,
Interesting.
or potential livelihood.
Yeah, because for me, it's, we're entering this phase with the future or the current low carbon economy, renewable energy, electric vehicles, where there does seem to be a disconnect between folks' recognition of the need for all of this wonderful stuff, right? Electric vehicles, solar panels, lithium ion batteries in all sense. And then where is all that stuff going to come from? And what I love about your your campaign and the idea of better in our backyard is that, if you care about how this material is mined and produced, then you should want it close to you where you can keep an eye on it, right? And where we have a greater impact on the environmental, social, and governance standards under which that metal is extracted. And otherwise, it ends up being mined in countries that have a lot, where you have a higher risk of things being mined irresponsibly. And so, folks, if you take the global perspective, you should want it locally.
Exactly. I mean, you're 100% correct, Emily. I mean, and that's kind of what we try to tell when, if I'm ever having a conversation with someone that is in disagreement with some of the projects that we support, or just increasing domestic mining in general, I just ask them, because a lot of them are huge supporters of the renewable energy industry, to your point, and they're kind of getting into this conundrum a little bit because they support these technologies, but they don't support, like, in a way, they're not really supporting the responsible mining of the minerals needed for those very technologies if they continue to offshore that demand to other countries. Like, to your point, I think 70% of the cobalt that the U.S. Utilizes is coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is notorious for
Hmm.
utilizing child labor. I think the last stat I read is that there's estimated that over 40,000 children are working in the mines of Congo, when we could be creating more jobs here in the U.S. that pay very well, and where we have high environmental labor standards and also labor standards as well. And yeah, there's kind of a disconnect there. It's and the logic is odd to me. If you're caring about carbon emissions from, from the oil and gas industry, or if you're a big believer in wind turbines or solar panels and all that stuff, we can disagree on those technologies, but at least we could, but let's say at least agree on, we should get our minerals here at home where the carbon intensity to mine these minerals are going to be less. I mean, for example, a couple
Right.
months ago, Twin Metals came into an agreement where they're going to use an all electric fleet to mine the minerals on site. I don't think too many
Hmm.
mining companies in foreign countries are looking to make those kind of deals.
Yeah, and I think and so much of that comes down to education, right? And we here in the U.S., at least speaking for ourselves, we don't mine a whole lot anymore. So it is this disconnect because people don't see it. They don't maybe have friends or family that work in the mining industry, so they don't understand how we do things now. And I wonder if you could, speak a little bit about that, the need to educate and kind of reach outside of our industry to have folks understand who we are and what we do better.
Well, I think one good way to reach out to others, and that I've noticed has worked in the past, is just touching on, you can't have a cell phone without minerals. You can't have any,
Mhm.
if it hasn't been, one of my favorite quotes is, if it hasn't been grown, it has to be mined. And that was something that, I didn't really come to a realization until I moved to Duluth area. I wasn't really familiar. I'm 28 now. I wasn't that familiar with mining up until I was around 21, 22 years old. So I think making that connection and telling them, not only this isn't just about good paying jobs and whatnot. We essentially just, we need these minerals, and where are we going to get them from? Are we going to get them from a third world country, or are we going to make sure that we get them first here at home, or from our friends in Canada and Australia second?
Mhm.
And right now, to your point earlier, we're not mining very much here because the permitting process is taking very long. I mean, pretty long. I mean, you look at Polymet's NorthMet project; they've been going through the permitting process for over 17 years,
Yeah.
and the average timeline it takes to permit a mine in Canada is 3 to 5 years. And in Australia, I believe that number is very similar. And they've been proving that they can mine responsibly on a much shorter permitting timeline. So, kind of showing those facts, and also relaying to why we need these minerals in our everyday life is the best way that I can attract new followers and new supporters of mining. But however, just like anything else in life, there are certain people out there that no matter how many facts you throw in their face, no matter how many jobs and families that you show that the mining industry is supporting, at the end of the day, they still think mining's evil, and that everything should be powered by wind turbines and solar panels, and not wanting to think about where those minerals are coming from.
Yeah. And that's where I always love to joke. I'm like, well, continue to tweet your outrage from the phone that that we make possible, right? Like yeah, I mean I totally agree. I think we've got to talk more outside of our industry to pull people in to demonstrate our value, right, to the world of why we're an important industry and how we're changing the way that we do things. And sometimes it can be a really frustrating conversation on both sides, I'm sure, right? Because there is the reality that we are extractive. You will never have a zero footprint mine. That's just not
Mhm.
realistic. And I think sometimes we go too far as an industry in kind of what sometimes is greenwashing, right? And kind of the marketing of that. And we have to be more honest and realistic that no, there is disruption, there is impact, but it's worth it if it's done in the right way because of the value that we bring to the table, right? And the fact that you can't have all of these wonderful things without metal and mining. Um, and it can be a really hard thing to balance in those conversations. My personal experiences in emerging and frontier markets, really conflict and post-conflict countries, and I've seen the difference that the mining industry can make in creating jobs and building infrastructure and frankly lifting economies out of poverty. But if it's not done the right way, it can have huge negative impact from a development perspective as well. So we are responsible for making sure we do it the right way, but everybody else has to be responsible for hearing what we have to say.
Well, absolutely. And when you touch on the communities, I like, it kind of reminds me of the Iron Range a little bit, because when you look at Minnesota's Iron Range, it was built off the mining industry,
Mm.
and be ever since the mining industry has kind of been in decline. I would argue it's a mixture of innovation, but then also too just bad policy. And
Hmm.
you look at some of the Iron Range communities, Minnesota has grown by 40% in the last 40 years. And there are some communities on the Iron Range that have seen population drops by over 30% during that same time period. And it's kind of alarming because that's unsustainable. And there's a little bit of a frustration when the current administration is pushing for more renewable energy technologies, but not making too much of an effort to recognize the importance of creating a good domestic supply chain of minerals here at
Hmm.
home. Is what's frustrating about it is that we can bring back communities on the Iron Range to be much more thriving. We have an opportunity to do that while also still creating a much needed value in our domestic mineral supply chain here at home, where we know we can do it responsibly while also lifting communities up, if you will. To your point, I completely agree with you. And then also too, there's, like, and it can go the opposite way too. And that's why everything else in life, there's a balance, right? You can't have too much of
Right.
one thing.
Yeah, and I one thing that you had told me about earlier that I was unaware of was the role of Minnesota and the Minnesota mining industry in supplying iron during World War II. I mean, there is this long history of mining in Minnesota from a strategic supply chain or, critical minerals perspective, different minerals now than it was then. But could you share with us a little bit about that history and how that worked?
Yeah, so I don't have the stats in front of me, but currently, as it sits, Minnesota holds 90% of the estimated iron ore reserves in the US. And during World War II, Minnesota supplied 75% of the
Mm.
iron for the steel utilized during World War II. So without Minnesota's Iron Range, it's hard to imagine what the US would look like during
Mm.
World War II, and or post World War II, I should say. And when you fast forward to today, where I think really history is going to repeat itself in a way, is that we also hold 95% of the U.S. nickel reserves. Minnesota's
Mm.
Iron Range does. The other 5% is in Michigan's, in the UP of Michigan right now. Eagle Mine is mining that right now. And once they're out of ore, Minnesota will have close to all of the nickel reserves, or estimated or known resource reserves, in the U.S. And then in terms of copper, we hold over 1/3 of the estimated copper reserves in the U.S. And with cobalt, we hold 88% of the estimated cobalt
Mm.
reserves in the U.S. And where I see history repeating itself is that all three minerals are essential for renewable energy technology. So as we're seeing this push for a green energy future, if we want to get serious about mining domestically here at home, Minnesota is going to be the foundation to that.
And what is the pathway that you see to that? Like, what do you see an energy building around that support, or kind of where's the momentum headed?
I see it happening because, unfortunately, it's kind of somewhat become a partisan issue, whether or not if you support mining or
Mm.
not. So, here in Minnesota, a lot of it seems like many on the Democratic side of the aisle are against these projects, and then in the Republican side, they're very supportive. And and up on the range, I've noticed that there have been some candidates that are starting to show more support for twin metals that are on the Democratic side of it. Even our governor now has kind of went from taking a stance against the project to having more of a neutral stance, I would argue. So I think
Hmm.
that's a very positive shift, and we're also seeing with other energy policies, right? Like with nuclear energy, for example. Historically there's been this negative opinion, and now it's kind of becoming a bipartisan thing to support nuclear when they're seeing how efficient it is, because that truly is carbon free and really efficient. You're seeing that in California a little bit, like, and both sides of the aisle supporting it. And I really think that we're going to see that with copper nickel mining in Minnesota. I think as these supply chains, as people highlight it more, as groups like mine and yours start educating folks more on why we need these minerals, I think now you're going to start seeing more and more people come together and understand, hey, we need to strengthen our supply chain here at home. It's a national
Hmm.
security issue, and we're going to be creating good paying jobs at the same time.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's all about, balance, and we can't be over reliant on any one source, even if it's domestic, right? And that's why it's so important to get a diverse gathering of support, right, in different parts of the US and from the US and internationally to do this, because as an international economy, we are incredibly reliant on the mining industry. And it's crazy how little that is reflected in investment into the space as well as political support globally. And I wonder if you were speaking to a potential new mining investor who is looking at projects and maybe thinking about investing in a project in Minnesota, what would you say to that person who's maybe this is the first mining project they've ever thought about putting money into?
Ooh, that's a That's a tough one.
Because
Well, first, I would say thank you for being interested, and
yeah.
I hope you do invest in Minnesota, but be prepared to be in it for the long haul in terms of the permitting
Mm,
process, and because right now it's not certain. And however, as nickel and copper keeps increasing in pricing, and as we see the demand for these minerals go up, in a way, it's kind of a blessing with the minerals staying in the ground, because it because the pot of gold, if you will, is increasing in value day by day, minute by minute, literally. But at some point, we're going to have to mine these minerals. And so, what I would tell an investor is be prepared to be in this, for a multi-year thing at least in terms of getting through the permitting
mhm,
process. But understand that once you have a project up and running, you're not going to find a better workforce than the union building trades in northeastern Minnesota, and you're not going to find a region more passionate for the mining industry in general, given their history with the iron mining industry, because northeastern Minnesotans are pretty proud of that. The fact that they're mining iron ore every day, and they still got cleaner water than the Twin Cities and the southern Minnesota areas. And we want
mm.
to repeat the same thing with copper nickel mining.
I think that's such a great point, and I'm reminded of, again, going back to where I grew up, that a lot of times folks who aren't coming from rural areas don't understand that. As an example, hunters are some of the biggest conservationists you'll ever meet,
Yep.
right? And I really believe that there's a misunderstanding that geologists and mining people are some of the biggest outdoors environmentalists you'll ever meet, right? Because we spend so much time there. And that's what pulled us into this field, is loving being outside, hiking in the mountains. I mean, that's crazy geologists. Like, who else wanders around like looking at rocks? I mean, that's like, if you don't like the outdoors and you don't care about the environment, you don't go into geology and mining. Like, you just don't. It's not what pulls you in. And that comment you made about making sure that the water stays clean and that the environment stays clean. I mean, we are a lot of the folks that really care about those issues.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I couldn't have said it any better myself. I mean, you look at all the companies in northeastern Minnesota, or whether it's a Polymet or Twin Metals, or now recently that's been in the news this past year quite a bit. That's an exciting project, as well as Talon Metals out of Tamarack,
Hmm.
Minnesota. The
And
most.
Todd Malin's been on the podcast
Yeah,
as well. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I listened to it a couple of weeks back, and that was you did a great job on that show, and Todd did as well. He's a good colleague, and outside of Todd, obviously, because I think he's in DC quite a bit. What
Hmm.
Talon has done a really good job is they've been hiring local in
Hmm.
the area. Many of the folks that work in their office here at home are from the area. Same goes with Polymet. Same goes for Twin Metals. So, if they don't responsibly mine, they got to answer to their community members and their family members and their friends. So
Hmm.
they have the most to lose out of this. So the last thing that they want to do is be a detriment to the local environment.
Yeah. No, absolutely. That's what I think, keeping things local really increases the level of accountability. right?
Yeah.
So it's a really important point. Well, I've been asking all of my guests, if you could change one thing about the mining industry, what would you change?
Oof. Well, it's partly what we're trying to do with Better in Our Backyard. I'm trying, we talked about this a while back, is to really modernize the social media strategy for the mining industry
Mm,
in general. I think we've fallen behind a little bit as an industry as a whole in terms of educating folks on social. I don't think as many people are reading as newspapers as they used to. Blog posts aren't much of a thing anymore. And so I would say, from a social perspective, advancing in that way, sharing the story of responsible mining across the country. I've just noticed I feel like there's a need to that, and then in terms from a policy standpoint, is I do think that there is room to streamline the permitting process more, where it's not taking on average 10 plus years to permit a mine in the U.S. I would really like
mhm.
for us to be similar to Canada and Australia, to our friends in Canada and Australia, where we're permitting a mine in 3 to 5 years. And if you can't prove that you can mine responsibly within 3 to 5 years, then you're out. And then if you can prove it within 3 to 5 years, you're in. Let's get this rolling and let's get humming here. So I think that'd be the one thing I would change. So kind of a long question, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think your both points are really dead on. I think, social media, and of course, Jess Scanlon, our head of new media at Prospector, I'm sure would agree. We got to get on the TikTok. We got to get,
Yeah.
you got to get on
Yeah. We've been
Instagram
working on
and
that, by the way.
LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm still not quite sure how TikTok works, but I fully support it. I think it's because so much of this is about getting buy-in from the younger generation, and we have to communicate in a way that people find us as an industry accessible as well as informative, like you said. I mean, I have my stepkids are in their early 20s, and they love to remind me that Facebook is for old people, you know. Like
Yeah.
nobody goes on Facebook unless you're going to share something that you want your mom to see, right? So it's we've got to kind of meet folks where they are, and that means across the age spectrum.
Yeah, I agree. I've noticed that. I've noticed that on Facebook is a lot of my followers are a little bit older,
Hmm.
that's and it's that's the goes back to the messaging thing. You can never be complacent. I'm guilty of it with
Hmm.
Better in Our Backyard, even where, to your point on TikTok, it's a couple years ago when I started in this gig, I always wondered why people were so scared to use Facebook or LinkedIn, and by people I just mean the generation above me, if you will, and
Yeah. Yeah.
and I'm starting to see that now with TikTok. I can see why, because
Yeah.
it is intimidating when you're learning a new platform, but that's also where the challenge comes in. And the thing with social media, I almost compare it to working out. Is that you
Hmm.
got to get your 3 to 5 workouts in every week, and or work out every day. And but next thing you know, if you miss a week, then that week turns into
Yeah.
months, and those months turn into
It
years.
becomes
And
painful when you get started back up again.
yeah, and then the next thing you know, you wonder where the heck you are, and then
Yeah.
the same goes with social. It's, if we go a day without posting, or, it really bothers me, because it's like I'm flirting with the idea of being lazy about it. So it's kind of,
Yeah.
so like you got to stay consistent, and you got to keep that ball rolling. And the next thing you know, you start being creative. And so we just gotta force ourselves to do that with other platforms too.
Yeah, and I think so much of it is what we miss maybe in the mining industry is like new content creation. Again, Jeff Scanlon and I have talked a lot about this. We can't, you look at other industries and there's all this original content that really shows people what we're doing, who we are, where we're working, and it has to be done in a way that's not just super self-promotional, right? I mean, I love mining companies. I love hearing what they're up to, but it can't just be all how are they going to get their stock price up another 5 cents, right? I mean, frankly, I'm in the industry. I love these companies and I don't even want to listen to that or see that stuff, right? So it's got to be creative content that's going to pull new people in, because all the people who are already in, like, we already know this stuff.
Yep. No, no, I think there's room to put humor into it too, even a little bit. And
Hmm.
because it's kind of, in a weird way, I hate to say this, that I mean, people will probably get mad at me for me saying this, but it's kind of cheap, to your point, when you see it come
Yeah.
from, well, of course, the CEO of a company is going to advocate for their project. I mean, because they want, it's hard to take that seriously. But if you get local community members, or you get folks outside of the company talking about why it matters to them, I think that sends a bigger message.
We need mining influencers.
That's right. Yeah.
We got to get the Kardashians out and in northern Minnesota at some of these mines and see
Yep.
what that does for.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I am 100% with you. And again, I own my generation and my level of familiarity, but that's what I love about having a really diverse team at Prospector, folks from all over the world, different age groups, experiences, and backgrounds is, you start to hear from different people how they interact with data and how they start to understand what's going on in different communities and with different projects. And it's incredibly valuable because if you're only hearing from one set of folks, then you're only going to communicate in one way. So yeah.
Yeah, like what you're just saying. I mean, no matter what side of the aisle you're on a certain issue, it's always good to listen to what the other side has to say. I mean, I do that with every once. I probably should do it more, but even with my own gig, I welcome the opportunity to talk to someone that disagrees with me on it because they might say a point that might make me think differently or make me sharper, and but then also gain a certain understanding and empathy for where they're coming from.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a great note to end on. And thank you so much, Ryan, for coming on the rocks, and look forward to having you back soon and following up and hearing how things are going in northern Minnesota.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.